It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
This partnership is so important. It helps us go after the boats, both the engines and also the smuggler gang networks that are so dangerous and are profiting and getting away with it. They've been getting away with it for far too long.
The Home Secretary says cooperation with Germany and other allies can help smash the people smuggling gangs. Is she right? The Chancellor has been meeting her counterparts in Brussels. Can changes to the Brexit deal boost economic growth?
There are so many areas where we want to and need to work together if we're going to improve living standards for our citizens and improve competitiveness of our economies.
The former Tory donor Nick Candy has quit the party to serve as Treasurer for Nigel Farage's Reform UK. But will the government change the rules on political donations? Ahead of next year's spending review, Cabinet ministers are looking for savings in their budgets. Do we get the public services we pay for? Joining me today, Labour MP Dan Tomlinson, Conservative MP Dame Karen Bradley, Reform UK MP Richard Tice and Polly Mackenzie, former Director of Policy for Nick Clegg, now at the University of the Arts, London. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the story you heard in the headlines with this news story. Germany to tighten people smuggling law in UK deal. Yes, a new partnership with Germany and others, but particularly because Germany is tightening its laws so that people smugglers who organise small boat crossings to Britain can more easily be prosecuted. You heard Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, saying that this will be critical to smashing the gangs. But what difference will it really make, Dan?
Well, isn't this good news? We can see if a government takes seriously the issue of our border security, then we can make progress on it working with our international partners. For too long, I think we've treated this issue without the seriousness that it deserves, if I must say. One of the key ways to tackle the issue of the small boat crossings is to work with our partners in the EU and in neighbouring countries. It's great to see this meeting happening today and the fact that Germany is going to change its laws in order to make it easier for them to work with us to prosecute
It's quite
gangs.
technical, isn't it? Facilitating people smuggling isn't technically illegal currently in Germany if it is to a third country, like the UK, which is outside the EU. So I say again, what's it going to do? Is it a silver bullet to smashing the gangs?
Well, I actually don't think there is any silver bullet here when it comes to the issue of the small boat crossings. I think pretending that there's one switch that we can flick and that will sort this overnight is a fool's errand. Rather, we have to work across a whole range of different areas. We've put £150 million into our Border Security Command, giving it the powers it needs for national security so we can go after these gangs.
Yes.
And working with our partners as well does deliver outcomes.
Karen,
Yeah,
good news.
I absolutely welcome it. I mean, I was a minister in the Home Office. It's very clear that there isn't one single way to solve this problem. This is a multifaceted issue. There are gangs that are operating across the world, and the fact is that people want to come to the UK for various reasons, but we have to make sure that they don't have the ability to get here or to get to our borders in a way that wouldn't be acceptable elsewhere. So working with partners is absolutely clearly vital, but it's just one of a suite of measures. It cannot be the only thing.
Would you support the idea of bringing back the Rwanda scheme?
Well, I did vote for the Rwanda scheme, so, I think there has to be a deterrent as well. I think that you need to, if people have got to the Channel, they've got to the Channel for one reason and one reason only, they want to come to the United Kingdom. So, wanting to come to the United Kingdom, we have to find a deterrent to stop them. We have to break the business model of the smugglers. We have to make it that it's not worth their while to do it. There's no money to be made.
Dan?
Well, the processing of asylum claims fell by 75%, by 3/4 between the start of the year and the general election campaign. We've invested in that processing, which is a deterrent because we've now sent 9,000 people back on flights who didn't have the right to be here, and that is the deterrent that we've been working on. We've made big progress. You know, it used to be the case that the officers in the Home Office were just working on 2 cases a month. That's now gone up to 9 cases a month. That is the small.
It's clearly not a deterrent because 20,000 people have come since the Labour government won the election. And look, this is extraordinary. It's remarkable that in Germany it wasn't illegal to people smuggle to other nations outside the EU. But this will make no difference whatsoever. There is a silver bullet that will stop the boats. It's what we should have done under the previous government, but they don't have the guts to do it. Legally, you've got to pick up and take back to France, which we're entitled to do under the United Nations 1982 Convention of the Law of Sea. And what's interesting is I've been talking about this for over a year now. No lawyer, no government minister, no civil servant has said I'm wrong. And there's a reason for that, because I'm right.
Well,
and they're embarrassed.
Well, that's not true. I'll come back to that in a moment. But
Karen,
Karen, on your point, on Richard's point, I should say, that you didn't have the guts to do what Richard Tyson Reform UK is suggesting, and that's pushbacks.
I think pushbacks was something, you know, it's about all very well Greece to Turkey, for example, who are quite clearly not close allies, but for the UK and France, close allies, to be pushing boats back is very antagonistic.
Let her finish.
And I think, Richard, you know, simple answers to this is not the solution. This is a very, very complicated situation. We need to stop people feeling the need to leave their home countries in the first place.
Karen,
we need to work with those countries that they're transiting through. We need to work with those countries that are facilitating through whatever mechanism the illegal boats. I was calling 18 months ago for the EU to set up a boat register, for example, so that those boats, we could stop them before they ever got on the channel.
So pray tell me, why aren't the boats leaving and coming to us from Belgium? I'll tell you why, because the Belgian authorities pick up the boats themselves, which they're legally obliged to do under that same international treaty, and they take them back. But because France are failing in their international obligations, we've got to do the job for them. And the moment you do that, this whole thing stops. We know it works because it worked in Australia 11 years ago.
It was a very different situation, but sorry, go on, Karen. Hang on.
I fully support Belgium, and actually I've been working with Belgium MPs.
So Belgium can do it, the French can do it.
So that we can work closely with Belgium, because they're absolutely right that they are doing a fantastic job. But I do not think
so. You're accepting the French are doing a bad job?
I don't think the answer is to vilify the French in this situation. The answer
we've vilified the French for 300 years or so.
But the answer is to work with our allies, work with our friends, and try and stop this problem, which is a global problem.
Can we legally return people in the way you are suggesting without permission and consent from France?
Yes, and legally, France...
we can't.
We can, Joe.
I'm sorry.
Legally, Joe, France has a legal obligation.
Well, that's different.
Under that same international treaty.
France has not consented, and this is according to the House of Commons... Hang on. Let me finish the sentence. France has not consented to the return of vehicles to its waters. It's given a negative response to any proposals of what you call pushbacks. Without the consent of the country you'd be pushing the boats back to, the UK cannot legally adopt that policy.
That is not the correct interpretation of the Convention of Law at Sea, 1982.
As you use the word interpretation, so there are different interpretations.
Yes. Well,
all right.
So we do it, and then the French can sue us. That's how it works,
all right.
Actually.
What's your solution, Polly?
Well, it doesn't mostly involve shouting. I think that Karen is right, that this is incredibly complex, and at the heart of it is around international cooperation, right? There are huge numbers of conflicts around the world, in particular geographical areas. We know that climate change is worsening insecurity. We know that, in fact, people wanting to travel from poor countries to rich countries, like we are privileged enough to live in, will continue to increase. And in fact, the only thing that can help us to manage that is international cooperation. We should remember, of course, that the vast majority of the cost of supporting refugees falls on equally poor countries, often in the regions, and that humanitarian aid that we give to support, whether it is the UN or sort of state-by-state support for refugees, is absolutely critical. It's also vital that we find, if you want to disrupt the business model of the people smugglers, safe routes for people to travel here. And that is something that governments in recent years have closed down when there were safe routes, for example, out of Afghanistan for Afghan interpreters. No longer possible. If you don't have alternative routes, and that probably requires major new international negotiations. The reality is what we have is a system that's it's absolutely not fit for purpose.
Right.
And the result of that is absolutely grotesque abuses of the law, which both lead to profiteering by criminal gangs that circulates in other parts of the illicit economy, and the exploitation of incredibly vulnerable people. Nobody wants to see that, but we can't imagine that there is a simple solution or, in fact, a way for them to make the problem go away.
Do you support more safe routes opening?
Well, the thing about safe routes is actually we've got safe routes already.
Well, where are they?
750,000 people came into the year to June 23 legally under the visa system to the United Kingdom. We
Hang on,
have safe
hang on. We're not talking about the net migration. Let's focus on safe routes, which we have had for Hong Kong, for Ukraine. We did have one for Syria. I don't quite know what state that is.
When someone is rejected, but the point, we can't accept everybody.
No, I'm not asking that. Should there be more safe routes for people to apply for asylum?
We've already done more than our bit. Over 500,000 people, asylum seekers in the last decade or so who've come to the UK.
But
we
that's
can't take everybody.
hang on. That's less
if someone is
than almost
rejected,
every other EU
Polly, if someone
country
is rejected under a safe route and they then come here illegally, what's your response?
I absolutely think that we should have enforcement, but I'm
contesting
your claim that we have done more than our bit. In fact, the cost of supporting refugees in the UK is substantially less than many, many other countries, and particular countries within region, including very poor countries, who absorb huge quantities of cost and burden.
Right. Let me just come to that. Do you think there should this government open more safe routes for people to travel here and apply for asylum?
Look, I just think I understand why lots of people voted for reform at the last general election, because they wanted to see change in this country, change from the Conservative government, which had failed on issues like migration. I know we're talking about the boats, but 900,000 people coming in 1 year.
In net migration. 22 to 23.
But there is, of course, though, a difference in approach between Labour and Reform. 300 years of vilifying the French, I think you said earlier. I know it's a joke, but, you know...
Look, Dan, the point is you haven't got a policy.
Let him finish his point and then I'll get your response.
700,000 net, you won't put a number on it.
In contrast, we have got a Prime Minister that's making efforts to work closely with our European partners, went to France on Remembrance Sunday to stand alongside Macron and is working closely with neighbours in Europe so that we can tackle this issue.
Won't commit to reduce net immigration?
Well, the Conservatives committed to reduce migration 100,000 over and over again and never managed to get there. We know that these things change over time. If you commit to a certain level and then, as I think there's cross-party consensus on, we allow people to come in from Ukraine and then suddenly, because of a hard cap that you set, you are not able to let the... person who would come in to work in the high-tech sector come in. That just doesn't quite work.
Kemi Badenoch says she would like to see a cap, and this is on net migration. This is on the migration and the visas that are handed out by government, legal migration, as opposed to the small boats. What do you think that cap should be?
So I think, first of all, it's worth saying that before the Brexit referendum, actually, we had got migration down to just over 100,000 net migration. That year, 2015, it was very, very close to 100,000.
Quite a long time ago.
It is quite a long time ago. Then we had the referendum. Then we had the different immigration system. But importantly, we then had COVID. And we have to remember, for 2 years, the world closed down.
And so, hang on.
The figures that you saw... A large proportion of that 700,000...
But you've never hit tens of thousands.
A large proportion of that were UK nationals coming home after COVID. If you've been out of the country for more than 12 months...
Hang on.
It is absolutely the case that they are part of the immigration figures.
Calculating net migration is actually very odd and peculiar thing, right? So if you decide that you care about migration because you're worried about pressure on infrastructure and lots of people coming into the country, OK, that's one thing. Lots of people argue that they are worried about migration because of cultural change. Well, so if you have a net migration figure and, let's say, 2 million true-born British people leave and 2 million people from India come into the UK, well, then net migration 0, but you've had cultural change. It's a very odd thing to do. And as Karen says, British people returning home.
The gross number's 1.25 million, 1.3 million.
And Richard, we're going to move on because I want to remind people of Politics Live being on tomorrow at the earlier time, of course, on a Wednesday at 11:15 ahead of Prime Minister's Questions. It's the penultimate Prime Minister's Questions of this term before the Christmas recess. You can see there Kemi Badenoch will be asking the questions of the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. Let's have a look at this headline in the Standard. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, wants EU relations reset to drive economic growth. She was the first Chancellor, actually, who has attended the Eurogroup meeting of EU finance ministers since Brexit. She said that the meeting she wanted to reset relations after an antagonistic few years of relations between the UK and the EU, referring, of course, to the previous Conservative government. Dan, how are you going to get better trade and cooperation with the EU?
Well, I think sometimes before you get to the nitty-gritty of policy detail, you need to think about politics, and that's what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have been doing. It's really important to reset the relationship after a period since we left the EU where the previous government didn't really want to work at having a constructive relationship with our partners. It's the first time...
Well, let Karen respond. Is that true? Do you recognise that characterisation?
Just one specific point that you raised.
Yeah.
It's the first time that a Chancellor has gone over to speak to their finance counterparts since we left the European Union. I don't know why the Conservatives didn't do that before. It suggests that they were more interested in sort of political football with our near neighbours rather than a constructive economic relationship.
Well, I think we're involved in a large number of conversations and discussions and summits, etc., with our friends in Europe. But Brexit was always a process, not an event. The fact that the country voted to leave the European Union and we have left the structures and institutions of the European Union doesn't mean that we don't continue to have a relationship and doesn't mean that we don't...
But was it antagonistic in the way that Dan has just said?
I don't recognise that, but I wasn't in government at the time. So my relationships with my friends in the European Union parliaments are very, very good, and we work closely together on lots of issues, including Ukraine, where I think you've seen Europe coming together in an extraordinary way.
Right, but was the deal good enough? Was the deal good enough that was struck with the EU in terms of trading relationship?
Well, as I say, it was always a process, not an event.
So no.
It was always going to be, we had to get out. Once we were out, we could then start to look at what the right relationship should be around the world and with the EU.
Were you disappointed with the deal in terms of what the UK got out of it?
I think we got the deal that was right for the UK at the time, which was the only deal Parliament... Well,
Sort of a terrible fit of coughing.
Yes, I suddenly thought you've got some water there.
I'm afraid that the Parliament had rejected deal after deal. Parliament had said no to many, many deals, and there was a point at which the only deal that Parliament would accept was the deal that we took.
What do you think this means, resetting the relationship? We've heard the sort of issue about tone and being nicer, better partners in the room. But what is it really going to amount to?
I think it's going to amount to small amounts of incremental change, and that is a good thing. But the Labour Party is stuck between the economic realities of the continued, completely unnecessary friction in terms of the movement of goods and services and people between ourselves and, you know, the largest single market anywhere near us of the European Union, and the problem of politics. Of course, the Labour Party is worried about the rise of reform. They are worried about basically the sort of political sewer that Brexit became as an issue, and absolutely convinced that if they were to talk about any return to something that could be characterised as free movement or re-entering the single market, that would come at too great a political cost. I think the reality is the fundamentals over time are changing as the economic and social case for a return to the European Union becomes stronger, and the politics and demographics. Well, in my view, you're welcome to disagree with me, Richard.
But I mean, the point of all of this is about how do you drive economic growth? And
joining single markets tends to work.
You do realise that Germany's in recession. You do realise there's no economic growth across the European Union. So why would we want to go back closer to something that economically is patently failing when the US is growing by between 2% and 3% a year and will grow faster?
Well, let Polly respond.
I think the chances of a trade deal with the United States remain vanishingly small.
You do realise there are our biggest single trading partner?
I do know that, yes.
And we have a positive
But I'm also
trading
aware
relationship
that they've
with
just elected a president who's really keen on tariffs.
He's keen on growth.
Yeah, so am I.
And they've got growth, and we haven't got growth.
Let her finish her point. You've put to her something about America and a trade deal. Polly?
Well, he remains absolutely hell-bent on increasing tariffs, on making America great again, perfectly reasonable proposition, but by buying American. Actually, the expectation that our source of growth will be solely in partnership to the US, we had enormous value to the US as a bridge to the European Union. We decided to surrender that position, but as a bridge, by leaving the European
Right. I mean,
Union.
do you accept, Richard, that Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK, said last year Brexit has failed, that we haven't actually benefited from Brexit? Well, hang on, Brexit economically, and that since the referendum in 2016 we haven't delivered on borders. Put that to one side. What would you do to benefit from Brexit
that's
economically?
Why I was coughing when Karen was saying we got the deal we wanted. We got the bad side of the deal. The EU got a great deal. They essentially handcuffed Northern Ireland, still within the European Union, And
there are new rules coming into play on
the Conservative
Friday.
Party chose not to deregulate, which it could have done. It deliberately decided to retain the laws. The reason America's doing well is because it's got cheap energy, because it drill baby drills, because they've got lower regulations, and they've got lower taxes.
So you would,
and that drives economic growth.
lower regulations and lower standards, and that's how you boost economic growth.
You have smart regulations, not daft regulations.
Which
The
ones?
EU
Which ones?
Thousands of them. I mean,
Right.
the
I know.
Conservative
I often
Party-
have people saying thousands and then can't quite name any.
Well, actually, Joe, the Conservative Party had a list of 4,000 regulations they were going to get rid of, and then Prime Minister Sunak bottled it because he wanted to be nice to Ursula
But do you
von der Leyen.
agree that Brexit's failed?
But
Nigel Farage has said
Brexit
Brexit's
is a
failed.
great opportunity. Where Karen's right, it's a process. The opportunity's still there.
OK.
What you need is Nigel to be Prime Minister to make a great success of it.
Right, but what's the price or the cost to get that closer relationship down? Faisal Islam, my colleague, the BBC economics editor, has said, just spoken to Spanish Minister Carlos Cuerpo again. Is youth mobility scheme a red line in Brexit reset? It's an important element from EU side. We want to put it on the table, in particular also from the Spanish side, and says that the UK economy could benefit by engaging constructively. Should that be considered, giving the Spanish that youth mobility scheme?
Well, we should definitely engage constructively with our partners.
That wasn't my question. Should that be... Let's talk about specifics.
We aren't considering the youth mobility scheme, no. And
in any
I
shape,
actually
sense
think
or
this comes
form?
back to the bigger picture point that Polly was raising around the politics here. It isn't a constraint that has come from outside. We said in our manifesto that we won't be rejoining the single market and the customs union. Yeah. And I think it's right that we stick to the commitments that we made. We've seen what happens when governments don't stick to the commitments they made. And also, let me just say on growth, actually reopening those questions, all of the instability that would provide. The big thing that this government's been focusing on when it comes to the economy in recent weeks is providing that stability, and I don't think it would be the right thing to do to reopen that question again.
But the EU will want something. It is still a conversation, a discussion, a negotiation. What can the UK give?
Well, there will be negotiations ongoing, I'm sure, between now and I think it's 2026 when the deal comes up for renewal. It's not for me, Joe, on your panel to come up with the specific thing.
But do you accept that they would want something?
It's definitely going to be give and take. That's the way a negotiation works.
Would you consider a youth mobility scheme, even limit it, as part of a constructive engagement with the Spanish or the EU in order to get that closer cooperation on trade?
I think we shouldn't be doing negotiations on the BBC, however great your programme is, Joe.
Not negotiations, but ideas.
But I think, look, let's let the politicians, let the leaders do their negotiations, and then let's see what Parliament thinks of what they bring forward. We've seen when Parliament hasn't been happy with things that have been brought forward. We've seen when Parliament has accepted things. So let the leadership get on with that. We, as the Conservative Party, will scrutinise fully what comes forward.
But you're broadly happy with the deal as it is?
I want to see what they bring forward. That's the important thing. As I said, it's a process, not an event. Let's see what comes next.
Keir Starmer was asked last year, Polly, if he accepted that the economy, as he was a former ardent Remainer, did he accept that the economy will always be poorer, that the economy will always be smaller for as long as we stay outside the EU? And he said no. He said he didn't accept that. He felt that the economy could be revived with a new deal. Do you believe him?
Sort of from an economic perspective, no. But, of course, what you see is the economists, they draw lines on charts, right? And there's a counterfactual. And in, a sort of an alternative version of history, we're slightly richer. So that's the kind of thing you're comparing against. And that rarely works in political conversations because actually what people are most interested in is where are we now? Where are we going next? And so I can understand why Keir Starmer would want to frame that, not in a defeatist way, but absolutely with ambitions for growth. They have accepted, Dan's right, they've accepted the economic cost for what they consider a political gain of staying outside the European Union. That remains to me, extraordinary, given that they are being very brave about the political cost, for example, of house building. They say they'll build 1.5 million houses. I wish that the government I had served in had done anything so brave in terms of contesting, NIMBYist culture. Why will they take those risks and not those on Europe? I genuinely find it unfathomable.
Could you be a bit more politically ambitious when it comes to this?
The reaon why we're taking some risks on others is because of what we put in the manifesto that we won.
But the manifesto
we won the election on.
You've got causality tied up, right? You decided to take the political risks and then you put it in the manifesto. And now you're saying that the manifesto is the reason.
On the back of that manifesto, I think the political decisions looking at what the public wanted, looking at what we could deliver, and we needed to rebuild trust after the last election. That's why we changed our party. That's why Keir turned things around. And now it's important that we deliver on that, I think.
What do you think about a mobility scheme? A limited one that would allow young people to come here in exchange for closer cooperation?
At the end of the day, we must be in charge of the choice.
Yeah, so
we
you
must
wouldn't be
decide,
against it?
We must decide how many people come into the United Kingdom to work and to integrate and where they come from. So as long as that choice is ours and whether we decide, I mean, our preference is to have net zero immigration.
I know.
Because we've got plenty of people in the country. Our challenge is actually to get our own people working. We've got 9 million people economically inactive. No, I tell you what, that is most ambitious, to get our own people working.
Absolutely.
Why are you so worried about other people from other countries and not our own people?
What were you saying was unambitious?
Well, again, you're falling for the lump of labour fallacy, right? That the way to create
9
jobs...
million people without jobs, economically inactive, is quite significant, Polly.
It is, absolutely. And one of the things that you do is you help to grow the economy, partly by importing talented people, importing people who can support our NHS, so that it has the workers that it needs, who can then provide the treatment to the people who are disabled or suffering from ill health, which is preventing them from working. There is not a fixed system in which there's only a certain number of jobs and a certain number of people.
Funny that, it seems to work in other countries.
Well, actually,
helps everybody.
Hang on, Richard, even on your manifesto, even on Reform UK's manifesto, yes, you do talk about zero net migration, so the number of people leaving would be the same as the number of people coming in. But there are exceptions.
And the
exceptions are healthcare or social care, and that could go up to 90,000. Well, that was the number that we had come in last year. So that's not, is it, zero net migration? And there are other exceptions.
It's our choice, and we've got to train our own people back into work.
Let's have a look at this headline in The Independent. Nigel Farage has found his donor-in-chief to fund his push to be Prime Minister, which we heard you mention just a moment ago. And it is not Elon Musk. Property magnate Nick Candy, you saw in the headlines, has turned his back on the Tories as a major donor and announced he's taking his money to Reform UK to make Nigel Farage Prime Minister. He's turning his back on the Tories. What's your response?
Well, it's his money. He can choose to spend it how he wishes. I want to make sure that we can demonstrate that the Conservative Party is actually the party that stands for moderate centrist politics, centre-right politics, where we can deliver for people and improve their living standards, improve their health and their happiness and their well-being and their education. That's what we have to demonstrate. That's what we have to show.
Is it a loss, Nick Candy, going from being a Conservative donor to the Treasurer?
I've never met the man, so I'm not going to say whether it's a loss or not.
Right. Is this going to be how you're going to float, not in a public company sort of way, but float Reform UK on the back of money from Nick Candy?
Well, the truth is every political party raises money from donors in order to get good people to help pursue its objectives, and we're no different in that, and we're delighted that Nick Candy has defected from the Conservatives, come to us. There are many other business people who are recognising the progress we're making and saying, can we talk, can we help? So look, this is, and it's great.
What's he asking for?
It's great for democracy. Can we help in terms of giving donations? Can we help in terms of ideas, how we grow the economy, how we get people back into work, how we get rid of daft regulations that we touched on a little bit earlier? Because
I still don't know what they are, but anyway, yes.
Well, there's a list of 4,000 under the Tory the Tory plans. We have to get this economy growing, and at the moment, after this blunder budget, many business people are very disappointed and saying they're reducing investment.
Are you worried about it at all?
Of course you worry. Of course, any political party. We've just suffered the worst election defeat in living memory. So of course we're worried. Of course we need to rebuild. Of course nobody is being complacent about this at all.
Why do you think people are defecting from the Conservatives to Reform? Small number, admittedly, but Andrea Jenkins, the founder of Conservative, but no ideas. I mean, in terms of trying to hold on to support within the Conservative Party, what needs to be done?
You'd have to ask them. All I know is I'm a Conservative through and through, and I'm sticking with the Conservative Party.
Well, last week it was reported that Labour is examining proposals to limit how much individuals and companies can donate to political parties as part of an effort to tighten the rules around money in UK politics. If you have a look at this headline, government may cap UK political donations to limit foreign influence. And there was certainly mention of it in your manifesto. What are you going to do?
I don't know what the exact plans are, but I think it's right that we do look in the round at political donations, making sure we've got the laws that the public can look at and think, you know, that's reasonable, the way that works. I think that's very important. I would also like us to look at political spending. I think the Reform Party, I saw that your new candidate in Lincolnshire said that she was bribed to join the party, which is a bit troubling. I think as well as looking at income, we should be looking at what parties are spending their money on. I think that is a bit concerning, I should say.
Right. Would you like to see political donations capped?
To me, I think the much more important thing than getting into the detail of political donations is actually when we go to the next election, will this government be able to stand on a prospectus that says we have delivered change for people, and then will people be able to put their trust in us again in a way they weren't able to do with the Conservative government last time? That's what we're focused on. And in the end, when the British people look at the political parties in a general election, they will be able to make their judgment. They made their judgment on us compared to Reform. You know, we've got 80 times more MPs in Parliament than Reform.
For double the number of votes with our flawed electoral system. Look, the reality
Did you want to respond, by the way, to the
the
claim about the bribe?
Obviously, no one's been paid anything to come to us. Those allegations are just complete nonsense by people who had nothing to do with the party.
So she made it up?
She was referring to someone who had nothing to do with Reform. People are allowed to talk. We live in a country of free speech.
Didn't she say that she had accepted a bribe?
No, she didn't. No, Dan, if you're going to make suggestions, make it accurate, please. OK, she didn't say she'd accepted a bribe.
Not accepted,
and it's not a bribe. She said that someone else talked about money, but it was nothing to do with Reform. Someone no one involved with Reform, and no one's been paid anything. Let me make that absolutely clear. So that's point number one. The key point, though, is that in terms of capping donations, let's just remind ourselves some of the biggest political donations in the last 12 months have been to the Labour Party. I think Lord Sainsbury has given a multi-million-pound sum. I think Dale Vince, for example, has given a multi-million-pound sum. So if you're going to talk about limiting donations, you've also got the unions. So it may well be that actually it impacts the Labour Party the most.
But there isn't a proposal. Yes,
I just say that you're right. She didn't say she had accepted a bribe. I want to just make that clear for the record. Just to be clear, I think it's really important that we do have people being able to fund our political parties. I'm really thankful for the people that have provided donations to Labour that enabled me to win in my seat in Barnet, where we'd never won before. And so, yeah, I'm not objecting to money being involved in politics. I think it's right that we have a look at this, and I think there'll be plans coming forward in the coming months. Do
you agree with Richard Tice that unions should be included in any sort of new proposals or reforms around political donations?
Well, it is the same as when a private person or business owner gives money to a political party. It's right that it's declared and that it's sort of public and transparent. That is the important thing when it comes to donations, in my view.
Is there a case for capping political donations because the public usually don't want to fund these things themselves?
I'm aware that I come from a position of privilege, which I'm not currently involved in frontline politics, so it's much easier for me to say what none of my friends around the table are able to say, which is, of course, there's a case, right? Politics should be a contest of ideas in which every person is equal. We have equal votes, but we don't have equal campaigning. You know, I think most people will find it literally impossible to even imagine doing what Nick Candy has done, or David Sainsbury, and writing a seven-figure cheque for an amount of money to donate to a political party. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to be able to do. And it makes a difference to the campaigns. It makes a difference to the number of people you can hire. And it is profoundly wrong, profoundly, for our politics, how we choose to run the country, to be shaped by who has money and not who has the best ideas. Richard? All parties should change, and caps should be, there should be £100, £200 maximum that any individual should give to a political party.
So how is any political party going to be able to employ good people to run good campaigns, to come up with good policies that help the country grow and that help make the least well-off better off?
Because that's a great question.
That's
in Germany, for example, the parties are affiliated to basically party-affiliated think tanks that do a lot of that policy work. There are other institutions who do similar sort of policy work in both aligned and non-aligned ways in many European countries, again, state-funded. Of policy work, again. I mean, the Institute for Fiscal Studies,
so really you're recommending state funding of taxpayers' cash to political parties in the United Kingdom?
Well, I am saying that individuals should be allowed to donate to political parties in small amounts. I think that there is a case for state funding of political parties, pretty limited. But crucially, there is also a case for state funding of the infrastructure for both government and non-government political and policy thinking, as happens in lots of European countries.
Well, Karen, are you persuaded?
Well, I think that the system we have with full disclosure and people being able to question and challenge as to where money has come from does actually work. It works well. So, you know, I've been challenged on donations I've received in the past, as of every other politician, I'm quite certain. We have to declare that interest when we speak in Parliament, and we have to be absolutely open. Any suggestion that money buys favours cannot be acceptable.
No, but I mean, would you be in favour of a cap?
Leaflets,
I mean,
right?
would
it makes a difference to the outcome of the election.
Leaflets don't come for free. I mean, the printer has to be...
Exactly. Well, but that does mean that it's a contest of ideas in which some people are allowed to amplify that, right? Marketing spend is effective. That's why people spend the money on it. And actually, if that is a competition between companies for who gets to buy what sofa, great, not a problem. But actually, when it's a battle for ideas, it's actually much better for it to be cheap and accessible for everybody.
You have to
even
have something
without
to
the
sell.
resources.
That's the point. You have to have something to sell. You can't just put a leaflet through the door and expect to get votes. You have to be able to demonstrate that you're the best candidate. It's hard work. It's flipping hard work.
Of course it is.
And there's a lot of shoe leather goes into it.
I'm aware of one.
hear your pain here, Karen.
But the money does help, and it would be better if it were cheap.
Right, but do you accept it's probably never going to be taken on board?
I do accept that. Oh, again, it's a dynamic. It's why we're stuck with the electoral system we have as well.
Because you refer to equal votes, but actually we haven't got equal votes.
Totally agree. We're in total alignment, Richard.
Oh, well.
But in order to get into a position of power to change things, you have to be able to try.
You are in a position to change things, and the manifesto did promise to reform political donations. Without a cap on donations, I'm not clear as to exactly what problem you're fixing.
I think you could look at a whole range of things, including the way that donations are declared, the floor beyond which they're declared. There's a whole range of things that I'm sure will be considered in coming months. I also don't agree with Polly that we should have public funding of our political parties. And in the end, what it goes back to is, will you, as a political party, put forward a prospectus to the country that they trust, with a leader that they trust? And if you're in government, as Labour is, when we get to the next election, have you delivered on the things that people want to see change on? And that's our hope and our plan, and that's why we set out this plan for change on Friday. So
and we will scrutinise it all, of course, over the coming months. Have a look at this BBC News headline: Stop non-priority spending. Treasury warns ministers. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has announced the latest spending review, determining how much is spent on public services broadly. And she's promised to take an iron fist against waste. I think we can have a little listen to something that she has said about it.
I have no doubt that we can find efficiency savings within government spending of 5%, and I'm determined to do so, because it's through finding those efficiency savings that we'll have the money to spend on the priorities of the British people. So part of this spending review will be cracking down on waste, cracking down on non-priority spending, so that we can focus on the issues, whether that's improving living standards, ensuring our streets are safe, or indeed reducing waiting times in the NHS. Those are the people's priorities, and that's what we'll be focusing on in the spending review.
Are there 5% of savings to be made in efficiencies in public departments?
Well, I'm not a member of the Public Accounts Committee, and I'm not totally close to departments at the moment, but every government tries to find efficiency savings. Every government tries to get rid of any kind of slack.
Is it just
in the
a lie?
system. I don't think it's a lie. I think it's
A line.
A line.
I meant, sorry. Not a lie.
Look, I think it is something that it's very laudable to try and find those things. But unfortunately, when you're in government, everything's a priority. And what people say are their priorities, actually, there's a load of other stuff they want to do. We have to bear in mind, I've said it before, we have had a pandemic. We had 2 years of the country being shut down. We spent an awful lot of money to keep businesses going and keep people in employment. And government departments were required to do so much more than they'd ever done before.
Well,
that does need to be...
Do you accept that, Dan? I mean, everything's a priority.
No.
What's not a priority?
We have been very clear about what our 5 priorities for change are.
Well, and your
with
6
our-
milestones
with
and your...
millstones.
No,
Not milestones, not
I'm
millstones.
so sorry.
We've got... we set out
Maybe
before
become
the election our plans for change, and we have then just last week been really clear about what are the different metrics that civil servants across Whitehall can be thinking, how does my spending feed into making sure that this happens? And there are definitely efficiencies that we can find. The Prime Minister mentioned one in his speech,
you cut winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners.
£100 million being spent on a tunnel to protect bats from HS2 trains that happened because of the changes that were put in place under the previous government. Those sorts of things we can definitely make progress
on. Do you think there is that much waste?
Well, I'm delighted that actually the Chancellor is adopting reforms contract, because then I was vilified for saying that we could save £5 and 100, and now Darren Jones is writing to all the departments saying save £5 and 100. Once again, reform is leading the way on this. And yes, and actually what I've learnt having been elected...
People voted for change and they're getting it with Labour.
Well, yeah, and let's see. I actually think the savings are greater. I've been approached by so many people in the public sector talking about the waste, whistleblowing on the quantities. It's off the scale. It's probably nearer 10% in many departments. It's outrageous, the abuse of taxpayers' cash.
Well, let's just ask, have you adopted parts of Reform UK's manifesto?
Well, one of the things that was in the Reform UK manifesto was, I think, £150 billion of spending cuts.
Of which 50 was exactly what we're just talking about.
I'm just not quite sure that those numbers were achievable. 150 billion, 90 billion pounds of tax cuts, 50 billion,
the first
50 billion pounds of spending
the first
increases.
50.
One of the things that I think people will see from this government is that we are fiscally responsible. We're not putting forward plans like the ones that were in the manifesto there.
You're now copying
hang on.
Very similar to what Liz Truss was doing, with big increases.
Yeah, but you're proposing,
as well as big
Dan is right. You're proposing tax cuts that it estimates would cost nearly £90 billion a year, and spending increases of £50 billion a year. Hang on, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, I won't let Labour say this, but the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said your sums don't add up.
Well,
so they're not really serious.
Labour clearly think they do add up because they're adopting our policy of 5. No, that's 50 billion. Let me just... The next bit, also economists now agree I was right, not paying bank interest on the quantitative easing reserves, which the economists, the FT and people like Robert Peston and others, even Gordon Brown, agrees with me that I was right on that.
If there was a reform government and those policies...
Yeah, I tell you what, we'd get some economic growth down and we'd cut wasteful spending. That's the imagination.
Can you imagine the reaction from the financial markets? That is Liz Truss on steroids. It's exactly what went wrong.
Dan, because I've run
Hang on.
It's exactly why we didn't have the financial and economic stability that we needed in recent years.
It does look like Liz Truss.
Because I've run a multinational FTSE 250 business, tripled the share price in 4 years, employed thousands of people... But people in the city know that I can make money and save money, and they trust me. That's the difference.
That's still up for grabs, I think. But anyway, let's have a look at this graph. Tax as a percentage of GDP. You can see under previous Conservative governments it reached a record high. It's now projected to go even higher, 29 to 30, at 38.2%. Now, it is a record high for here. It's not as high as some other comparable EU countries. But the broad question, Polly, is why do we have, relative to before, high taxes and struggling public services?
We are struggling with extraordinary demographic change. That is driving demand, particularly in the health service. And spending for the health service has gone up and up and up, but has struggled to keep up with that rising demand from our ageing population, more and more people in receipt of pensions. As Richard mentioned earlier, we do have a problem of economic inactivity. We've got a problem with people with ill health, and those waiting lists and queues in the NHS affect that. We know that we have a problem with the underfunding of social care leading to backlogs in health, and I'm only talking about the health system. We also have, chronic problems around a whole range of different services. And it's interesting that Richard is claiming credit for honestly the most boring policy idea of all time. Let's have 5% efficiencies. I mean, you find me a year in the last 50 where a politician hasn't said
sometimes
5%
boring is good,
efficiencies.
Polly.
Yeah, well, of course, it's totally fine. But in fact, the most interesting thing that's happened this week is Pat McFadden's speech talking about actually a much more integrated model of public service delivery, because so often when you do these efficiencies, department by department, function by function, what you miss is the ways in which spending between departments, and it's often best done at place level, can actually support the efficiencies in other departments.
Do you agree that for you couldn't get the balance right under Conservative governments? Taxes still went up, even though you kept saying you were the party of lower taxation, and public services were left struggling?
Well, I think you saw from that graph that taxes went up at the pandemic. That's the point at which taxes started to go up significantly. We've been through this global once-in-a-generation thing. But Polly is absolutely right.
Public services were struggling before.
But Polly is absolutely right. It has to be a whole-of-government approach. You cannot look at these things in a silo. You have to look at this as whole-of-government.
All right. Thank you for joining me today, all of our guests here. I will be back tomorrow as Build with more Politics Live at 11:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. And we will, of course, have live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. Join me then. Bye-bye.